This is a Tupolev TB3 heavy bomber, and this is a tank. It may look like the Soviets have mistaken this little vehicle for a bomb, but believe it or not, there's a good reason for it being dropped into a lake. Welcome to the bizarre story of the T-37A. To understand this vehicle, we first need to look at what came before it, the T-27. The T-27 was a Soviet tankette first produced in 1931. It was very closely based on the Carden-Loyd tankette, a British design that the Soviets had bought under license from the UK in 1930. The T-27 was a simple vehicle, essentially a tractor with a 7.62mm machine gun facing out the front. It was reliable and served its purpose well, which was light infantry support and reconnaissance. The only real issue being that the vehicle did struggle in difficult terrain due to its narrow tracks and the fact that the Soviets actually had issues finding crew for the vehicle, as only the shortest tankers could fit inside. But as more capable designs started to appear, the Soviets felt they needed something more modern. And as luck would have it, Carden-Loyd tractors had created a new series of vehicles, and this time they could float. Amphibious vehicles have obvious advantages over conventional tanks, and these advantages make the most sense for light reconnaissance vehicles. So, the Soviets began work on a floating replacement for the T-27, gleaning what they could from photographs and press releases about the new British design. A couple of different design teams were assigned to this task, with Soviet leadership seeing amphibious tanks as an extremely promising concept. The OKMO plant in Leningrad had their design ready by March 1932, and it was designated the T-33. It showed great buoyancy during testing, and was a capable amphibian, but performed poorly in other aspects, as well as being too complicated to mass produce. Meanwhile, the VATO No. 2 plant created a rival design known as the T-41. This was essentially an adaptation of the T-27, sharing a power plant, transmission and tracks, as well as stealing some aspects of the T-33. The OKMO plant was not going to be outdone, and started work on a new design, the T-37. Very similar to the previous two amphibians and to the T-27, the T-37 incorporated many of the lessons learned during the design process to create a more capable vehicle. And yet, both the T-37 and the T-41 were still lacking, with neither meeting requirements. A lifeline appeared in June 1932. The Soviets had managed to buy two of the Vickers Carden-Loyd floating tanks. Wasting no time, they cross-referenced their vehicles with the British design to create a vehicle that was more capable than both, the T-37A. The T-37A was more or less a new design, with aspects of its predecessors mixed in. The T-37A was a good bit larger than the T-27, with slightly wider tracks and a new suspension system to complement its more powerful gas AA engine. The single 7.62mm machine gun remained, but this time it was mounted in a turret in the centre of the vehicle. A relatively modern vehicle for 1932, the T-37A was a great design for the role it was meant to serve in, light armoured reconnaissance. Before the end of the year, the VATO plant was renamed Factory No. 37 and was given an order of 1,200 T-37As, making the vehicle the first ever amphibious tank to reach mass production. Such a huge order shows a lot of trust in the factory from Soviet higher-ups. This trust was misplaced. Firstly, the factory was still producing T-27s even through the first months of 1933, which put a lot of needless stress onto the T-37A production lines. And this was just one of the issues. In his report, People's Defense Commissioner Mikhail Tukhachevsky had this to say about the T-37A and Factory No. 37. Reasons for the unfulfillment of the T-37 tank program. Failure of the Podolsk factory to produce the hulls, an unready and unrefined technological manufacturing process, and unsatisfactory steel casting quality. The T-37A program has, instead of 250, produced only one workable hull in this half of the year. Changes were made immediately, with foreign equipment and machinery being brought into the factories, a change in leadership at the plant, and increasing the number of workers. However, it was only by the end of 1934 that there was a positive trend in the production numbers, and T-37As finally started trickling out of their factories and into their frontline units. The T-37A doesn't actually look overly amphibian. unlike later vehicles like the Vickers A4E3 or the Japanese Type 2 KME, both of which look a lot more like boats with tracks added on as an afterthought. The T-37A was first and foremost a recon vehicle, and hid its amphibious features quite well. The propeller at the back of the tank was quite modest, with a small rudder mounted in a frame just behind it. The mudguards on each side of the T-37A would double as water wings, and these sponsons would likely be filled with balsa wood or cork for added buoyancy and stability. The vehicle could only move through water at a walking pace, around 3 miles an hour. This was perfectly acceptable and well within specifications, but Soviet designers thought that there might just be a way of getting these vehicles to the front line a bit faster. Air deploying tanks was an extremely fast way of getting your armour for where it needed to be, but came with the unfortunate caveat that the vehicle would either have to land and unload the tanks, or, if capable, drop them by parachute. But the T-37A could float, so why not just let it splash directly into the water? The Tupolev TB3 could, in theory, airlift up to 3 T-37As, with one nestled between the bomber's huge landing gear and the other two on either side. The aircraft would then land at a suitable airstrip, and the tanks could be unloaded and be ready for combat in under an hour. Or, find the nearest big lake and just drop them right in the middle. In 1936, this concept was put to the test, with T-37As being dropped from their bombers into Lake Medvedye. For whatever reason, we would never see the T-37A being airdropped or water dropped during its service life. The vehicle first saw combat during the battles of Khalkhin Gol, fighting Japanese forces in Manchuria in 1939. However, it was first deployed in large numbers in the Winter War in Finland, where it was very effective in the recon role, having no issues in traversing marshy terrain or the many lakes of eastern Finland. T-37A tanks also provided light infantry support for Soviet attacks, and, despite their extremely thin armour and relatively limited firepower, served well in this role too. The Soviet army did not perform well as a whole, however, and many T-37As ended up being destroyed or abandoned. In fact, the Finns were able to capture up to 30 vehicles and press them back into service against the Soviets. The next conflict the tank would be involved in was the Second World War, later known to T-37A crews as the Great Patriotic War. The tank, serving its role as a recon vehicle, was naturally already deployed to the front line when the German Blitzkrieg smashed through it in June 1941. If it had been used as designed as a light recon vehicle, it's likely the T-37A would have performed just fine. But when deployed as an emergency light tank out of pure desperation, the losses were horrific. The vehicle's armour was unable to cope with anything bigger than a rifle cartridge, and the 7.62mm machine gun couldn't even put a dent in any of the Germans' frontline armoured vehicles. As a result, the vast majority of T-37As were lost in the summer and autumn of 1941, and by 1942, very few vehicles were left in running order. But the T-37A would see two more significant operations before the end of the war. On September the 26th, 1942, 10 T-37A tanks were tasked with crossing the Neva River, just outside of Leningrad. 7 made it into the water, with 3 suffering breakdowns in the way. Unfortunately for the Soviets, German sentries noticed the crossing as the vehicles made their way through the river, with withering German fire destroying another 4 vehicles before they reached the bank. The last 3 tanks were destroyed on the shore, resulting in a complete operational failure and the loss of all 10 vehicles. However, 2 years later, in July 1944, these 10-year-old vehicles would see their first big success, when 40 T-37As and T-38s of the 92nd Tank Regiment would cross the Svir River under artillery cover, supporting infantry on the opposite bank and destroying bunkers and emplacements after crashing through barbed wire and over enemy trenches. The 92nd Tank Regiment would successfully capture a 4-kilometre section of riverbank, losing only 5 vehicles in the process. The operation to cross the Svir River was the last known action of Soviet amphibians during the Second World War, and was a fitting last hurrah for the little T-37A. The tank would soon be replaced by the more capable T-38 and T-40 vehicles before the end of the war. Since there were nearly 1,500 T-37As produced, a few did manage to survive the war, and are exhibited in museums all over the world. 3 T-37As were seen in the November 2011 parade in Red Square, as Russia celebrated the 70th anniversary of the famous 1941 parade. An interesting little tank, and likely the only vehicle to ever get dropped from a bomber into a lake, the T-37A paved the way for modern amphibious vehicles. The Soviets really seemed to take a liking to the concept after the war, with vehicles like the PT-76, the PTS, BRDM, and the entire BTR and BMP series all being amphibians. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one, and if you're not already subscribed, please consider it. It would really help me out. I'll see you in the next video.